Welcome, everyone. On behalf of OPWA, I'd like to thank all attendees for taking an interest in today's webinar. Today's webinar is titled Meaningful Engagement with Indigenous Communities. This webinar has been organized by the OPWA Education Committee. My name is Philip Rowe from RJ Burnside and Associates, and I'm a longstanding OPWA Education Committee member and will host this webinar today. OPWA is a not-for-profit organization of professional public works practitioners. The Ontario chapter is one of 63 chapters that make up the American Public Works Association. We have over 500 members who are employed by provincial governments, municipalities, consulting engineers, utility companies, contractors, and suppliers. The Ontario chapter is also supported with two regional branches, the West Central branch in the Ontario region and the Ontario Valley branch in the Ottawa area. Ontario Public Works mission statement reads, connecting the public works community. OPWA provides its members opportunities to connect through workshops, conferences, and social events. Another great way to connect with those in public works is to join an OPWA committee. There are 9 committees within OPWA, so there are also many opportunities to match your interests. Your creative ideas and volunteer assistance is wanted. If you are not a member of OPWA, we encourage you to consider joining. OPW Connects is an opportunity to connect membership with education and technical resources. Typically, we plan for one webinar each month. Here are a list of upcoming webinars. June 25th, EV charging stations for beginners. August 27th, benefits of BMI 3D modeling. On September 24th, changing CCDC contracts. The Education Committee is always looking for more topics. Maybe you have a topic that you'd have interest in. Please contact the OPWA, and we'll make every effort to put those types of webinars on. All webinars are free. In order for us to, we have several upcoming events going on at OPWA. We have our very popular OPWA Golf Day. Will be held on June the 19th at Flamboy Hills Golf Course. That's filling up very quickly, so if you're interested, please go to our website. And we also have on June 21st, 2025 York Region Pride Parade. Many of those activities that you were just shown could not go on without our loyal sponsors. We have many sponsors, as you see on the screen. We greatly appreciate their sponsorship, and they've allowed us to continue putting together very dynamic activities, workshops, and many offerings. So to the sponsors, thank you. We're about to begin the main part of our webinar. The attendees, all your microphones have been muted and cameras will remain off. Questions will be addressed at the conclusion of the webinar. Place your questions in the Q&A box during the webinar. The Q&A icon is located at the taskbar at the bottom of your screen. Click to enter your question. The webinar duration is approximately 1 hour. I now have the honor of formally introducing our presenter from Walpole Island First Nations, Mr. Dean Jacobs. Dean Jacobs has worked over 51 years for the Walpole Island First Nations and now specializes in land claim and hosting agreement negotiations. He's an adjunct professor, interfaculty program in public health at Western University, a prize-winning author, Canadian Historical Association Indigenous History Best Article in 2021, served on numerous boards including University of Windsor Board of Governors, International Joint Commission, Great Lakes Water Quality Board and Research Manager Council, Ontario Foundation, Ontario Heritage Foundation, and the Commission of Environmental Cooperation, Mexico, US, and Canada. Dean is a former chief of Walpole Island First Nations. He is a recipient of 2 Eagle Feathers and 3 honorary doctorate degrees. While I introduce the webinar, I will ask Dean to set up his presentation on the screen. The Walpole Island First Nation community is nestled between Ontario and Michigan at the mouth of the St. Clair River, which is occupied by First Nation peoples for thousands of years. Today, home of Ojibwa, Potawatomi, and Ottawa, and represented by the Walpole Island First Nations, the Council of Three Fires. Dean draws upon his 5 decades of public service, working to help connect natural and cultural heritage and promote community well-being of the Walpole Island First Nations community within his homeland. This presentation will address standards of duty to consult and the duty to negotiate. This presentation chronicles the pre-Federation treaties between the British Imperial Crown and the ancestors of the Walpole Island, while addressing truth and reconciliation based on mutual trust and respect. It's a story about how Walpole Island First Nation navigates today's sovereign realities through asserting Indigenous governance while appreciating the importance of relationships to the land, honoring our treaties, and the value of meaningful partnerships. With that, I turn the webinar over to our esteemed presenter, Dean Jacobs. Welcome, Dean.
Thank you, Philip Miigwech. Bonjour, everyone. Good afternoon. Dishnakaz Bkejwanong Nadotum Wawawashkash Dunjaba Bkejwanong. Just to mention my Aboriginal Indigenous name, meaning the first glistening light of the morning. I'm of the Deer Clan and the place where the waters divide. So I'm going to start the presentation with a press release that occurred in September 22nd, 2022. And then talk about every slide following that will be context for the presentation in terms of the standards of consultation for First Nations in Ontario and across the nation. And then I'll finish with a case study of our First Nation, a view from Walpole Island First Nation. So it starts with our GTA. So it's not the Greater Toronto area. This is our Greater Tradition area. So actually, we should get some credit for the acronym GTA from the Toronto area because we were here first. This is a photograph for satellite photograph of our territory, which consists of southwestern Ontario primarily and the southeastern portion of present-day Michigan. I'd like to think that Walpole Island is a very special place. It's located below 3 upper lakes, the Huron, Michigan, and Superior. And of course, Lake St. Clair is the 6th great lake. So we have lower to Walpole Island is Lake St. Clair, Lake Erie, and Lake Ontario. So that puts us in the middle, I like to think, the heart and soul of the Great Lakes Basin. So on September 22nd, there was a gala in Toronto put on by Hydro One. And in their press release, they launched the industry leading, according to them, a 50-50 equity model with First Nations on new large-scale transmission line projects. Quoting from their press release, they say, "For too long, First Nations have borne the impacts of infrastructure development in their traditional territories without seeing the benefits." So I want to take a look at how we got to that press release in September of 2022. It starts with our homeland. There are no lines on this slide, just the traditional territory of the Walpole Island First Nation. One of the first lines on our homeland was our treaties with the British Imperial Crown. So every First Nation would have this background on a treaty context. We have a number of treaties from 1790 to 1827, and I can't go through all of the specifics of the treaties, but I can say that there are two understandings of these treaties. There's the Crown and today's government of Canada and other governments. They believe that these treaties were for we both believe that they're forever, but the view from Canada would be that this was extinguishment of our ancestors' rights in our traditional territory. However, the First Nation ancestors of Walpole Island, the treaties represent sharing of our territory. This opened our traditional territory to newcomers and settler and other governments. Without the treaties, there wouldn't be any legal occupation of our traditional territory. What was really silent in these treaties was the First Nations understanding of sharing, not just the land, but sharing the responsibilities and the obligations to care for the land. Simply put, it's the stewardship that we're sharing with others, and we continue to keep up our part of that stewardship in our traditional territory. So that it's important to understand the basic understandings of treaties going forward, because we all know we're all treaty people. You've heard that term before. Well, it's not something that's frozen in the past. Treaties, of course, are relevant today as they were in 1790 to 1827. Most of these treaties were shared with the British Imperial Crown. Just very a glimpse at these treaties. There were no harvesting rights extinguished by our ancestors. When you think about it, that was our ancestors' way of life. It was the living off the land from moving to camp based on the seasons. And I wouldn't think ever that our ancestors gave up our way of life for the future. What they were doing was sharing that obligation to steward our homeland. Very quickly, going north, a significant treaty in 1827, the Orange Area. That treaty is significant because it moved from a lump sum payment for the area that's colored in purple, which was a lump sum payment. The Orange Area, over 2,200,000 acres, was shared with the Imperial Crown in exchange for $10 per person. So the treaty outlines that there were the population 1827 of our nation was 440. So the compensation received in 1827 was $10 per person, $4,400. And we still receive that today. There has been no increase in the annuities since 1827. So it's for us, we view it as rental for 2,200,000 acres. And as landlords, it's time to raise the rent. So this is part of the reconciliation and understanding of the path forward, that we have to start with the homeland approach, then the treaties, and then we move on to the Indian Act, which was created in 1876. It was consolidated from a number of legislature acts from the 1820s, 30s to 1876, where it was consolidated. We still have the Indian Act today. So I like to think that this presentation is about how far we've come from the treaties to where we are today with 50% equity ownership and major transmission lines. Well, when I was born, according to the federal legislation called the Indian Act, a person was defined at meaning an individual other than an Indian. So the definition was for a person was an individual other than an Indian. So what was I? Well, I was basically an Indian that was controlled by federal legislation and by Indian agents that were parachuted into our communities. In 1951, that Indian Act was revised, so I became a person in 1951. I don't remember too much about that, but now that I know that this is how our ancestors were controlled and legislated over, I'm pretty insulted that I wasn't considered a person. We then move forward to 1960 before the Indian Act, but in 1960, you may be aware that the Diefenbaker government offered First Nations in Canada the federal vote. So all this legislation that was being drafted and made into law were drafted by, of course, MPs, members of parliament. And since we weren't persons or citizens, we couldn't vote federally until 1960. And then 9 years later, I think what's important too is that the Diefenbaker government offered First Nations to be citizens. It's up to every individual First Nation person to consider that offer. We're not automatically Canadian citizens. It's offered to us, so we have to take that up. It's a choice that a lot of First Nation persons have taken, and some haven't, because we are citizens of our First Nations first. In 1969, things started being turned upside down. The minister of the day, John Chrétien, he had the answer, he thought, for the so-called Indian problem. He introduced legislation called the White Paper Policy that would remove the distinction of Indian people and Indian reserves in Canada. So the idea by the Indian policy was to assimilate, to integrate Indigenous people once and for all in 1969, do away with our reserves and do away with our status as First Nation peoples. And that experiment would take, according to John Chrétien, 5 years. This was one of the first times that First Nation communities and nations across Canada got together, because we are diverse all across the nation. We have different languages, different cultures, but we are Indigenous peoples. We got together. We also got support from the white liberal press of the day, and we were able to get the white paper shelved And then for our First Nation, we started flexing our muscles in 1965 before the attempt to do away with us. We were the first Nation in Canada to be offered self-government in 1965. We were the first to do that in Canada. We took on the so-called pilot project, and we haven't looked back since. We saw tremendous growth locally since 1965 in our community, and we dealt with the white paper policy in 1969, continued to have not self-government. We still had the ghost of the Indian agent in our community, but we had self-management at best, control over our community. It wasn't full self-government because we still had the Indian Act. What was important that period from 1965 to 1975, we were able to see tremendous economic growth in our community. We saw roads being built, water lines being built, our education system got consolidated. We had a police force, a library, all within 10 years, tremendous multi-million-dollar growth because we did it ourselves. And you've seen attempts by other governments to recognize our First Nations as distinct nations. In fact, the Premier, Bob Rae, in 1991, you might remember this day, he signed a statement of political relationship with First Nations in Ontario that recognized us as distinct nations with our own governments, our languages, traditions, customs, and territories. I remember the backlash from especially the Bay Street community in Ontario. The headlines from the Bay Street was that Bob Rae just gave the province back to the Indians. Well, guess what happened the next day after this political relationship was signed by Bob Rae? Well, the sun came up and the earth kept on turning. Sort of a so what? We can make these kinds of statements, but we need the political will behind these statements to make change, positive change for the future. 1996 was another attempt to create a path forward on reconciliation after a Royal Commission report outlining the legacies of the past. And we all know the story that we have a long way to go to rid ourselves from colonialism. And the Royal Commission cost millions of dollars and many, many recommendations, but another study of so what? 1998, you've heard this before. It's not a new term. There was a statement of reconciliation in 1998 by the then Minister of Indian Affairs, Jane Stewart. She outlined it quite well in this one paragraph that we still have a long way to go, but another statement of so what? We haven't moved raised the bar much since then, but at least it's being raised. And of course, we have the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. In 2007, Canada, Australia, United States, New Zealand, they were four that didn't sign the declaration. They all have since, but we're now trying to make a move from the so what declaration to meaningful engagement and consultation going forward for all this, not just indigenous peoples. We want everybody to strive and be healthier and continue to benefit from the natural resources and especially our territories. Then another public apology in 2008. I certainly remember where I was at when I heard the public apology from Stephen Harper. It was, but again, I have to say another statement of so what. Then we've got another commission, the Truth and Reconciliation, 2015. Almost 100 recommendations. The one that most people point to is the free, prior, and informed consent, and that's important going forward because this is now the standard that we need to get to for engagement, consultation, and consultation with First Nations in Canada. You can read this and you don't see the word veto, but the free, prior, and informed consent have often been suggested by Indigenous peoples as our veto. It's actually an informed consent. So informed consent can mean a veto if, for example, and I've been involved in a lot of approval decision-making projects, that we approve of projects in our territory, and the way that could be a veto is that our approval could be up to 1,000 conditions of the approval. In effect, that would deny the project by the number of conditions that the proponent would have to satisfy to get consent. So that's just a different way of looking at veto. It is being informed and providing that consent through conditions. So I want to turn to the Walpole Island First Nation community now. I mentioned in my introduction that I'm from the place where the waters divide. There's three things that you should know about Walpole Island First Nation. You can use the same approach to other First Nations in Ontario and across the country. If you just know three things, that's a good start. So here's three points to know about Walpole Island First Nation. As I mentioned, we're a very special place. We're located under the intersection of two continental migratory bird flyways, the Mississippi and Atlantic. So you may know that the flyway starts in Mexico and comes up to James Bay area. Walpole Island has 17,000 acres of world-class wetlands. So it's been a resting place for migratory bird flyways over the centuries and decades. It's provided us with resources for hunting, especially. We're also home of 90 species at risk. We're a biodiversity gem in our Great Lakes Basin. However, we're also located on the St. Clair River, that in the 1980s, it was designated as one of 42 areas of concern by the International Joint Commission that the river was contaminated and needed remediation. We're doing better today, but we have a long way to go to restore the St. Clair River and making it not an area of concern. So those are three things that you can think about Walpole Island and other First Nations. They'll have their 3 points that you need to start your engagement and know this is connected to the meaningful engagement. You also have to realize that you're not the expert. It's the First Nation is the expert, and engagement, consultation, and accommodation is mutual. It's reciprocal. So First Nations have the obligation to engage, consult, and accommodate as well. So part of the accommodation is providing the information of who we are, and also the accommodation has been over many, many decades through treaties. It's accumulated accommodation over time. For Walpole Island and other First Nation communities, you start going into a little bit more understanding of the community. Walpole Island, I mentioned, we have 17,000 acres of world-class wetlands. We have coastal waters, tall grass prairies, oak savannas, and forest. So we have micro ecosystems. It's important to understand how the First Nation community sees itself in the wider context of our GTA. So Walpole Island is a biodiversity gem. The better off we are in terms of all of these micro ecosystems, the better off everybody else will be in our GTA. This is our playbook for land and community. They matter. It's about development. So we want to get to the good development. It's not just a veto over development in our territory. We want to make sure that the development is going forward. It's a good project. And quite frankly, if it is a good project, we want a piece of the action as well. So it's moving from the past of shifting away from the trying to avoid impacts, coming up with risk management strategies, and getting away from justified infringement. We've got to move the engagement and meaningful consultation to sustainable development, community well-being, equity participation, and resource revenue sharing. So on Walpole Island, before we get into the future imperatives, Walpole Island has been able to move forward from the past to the present and the future through specific claims on our pre-Confederation treaties. So going forward, we have to deal with those legacy issues, coming up with resolution of treaty claims and specific claims. We also, in Ontario, the First Nations collectively have been able to negotiate 1.7% of all the total revenue of the Ontario Lottery and Gaming Corporation. We also started to understand the Green Energy and Green Energy Act of 2009 in terms of equity participation. It started with a FIT program and it's now the LRP. We took advantage of our understanding of that legislation and created a number of projects in our territory and negotiated hosting agreements with proponents. And more importantly, we have taken advantage of the opportunity to be equity owners in 3 major wind farms, the Grand Bend Wind, 100 megawatt project. We're partners with the Bkejwanong First Nation. We're the majority equity owners in that wind farm. We're 15% equity owners in the North Kent wind farm, another 100 megawatt wind farm project. And the third wind project is the Bell River, another 100 megawatt wind project, another 15% equity ownership. What is good about that is our partners are Samsung and Pattern Energy, as well as the Chatham-Kent municipality. There's not too many First Nations that I'm aware of that have actually partnered economically with the local municipality. So we're in this together. We've also purchased over 15 million shares collectively. The 133 First Nations have chosen to purchase 2.4% of all the company's shares in Hydro One. We also have the announcement in 2022 by Hydro One of offering 50% equity interest to First Nations. We've taken advantage of that in $300 million dollar equity projects, transmission lines in our territory. We have finished one already, the Chatham to Lakeshore. We completed that under budget, $30 million under budget, and 1 year ahead of schedule. We're working on the Longwoods transmission line and the St. Clair. We have 50% ownership in those transmission lines collectively with the Three Fire Confederacy First Nations in southwestern Ontario. And we're in construction of the Tilbury Battery Storage Project, 85 megawatt battery storage project. So we hope to be in commercial operation this fall. So we have come a long way to get to some equity opportunities and move from the not being a person to being offered citizenship to being wiped off the face of the earth by the white paper policy. We vaulted into the Section 35 of the Constitution in 1982, the supreme law of this country. So it's taken a while, but we have come a way. I would call it more of a creep over the last few decades, but the future does look promising for our First Nations, but it starts with the meaningful engagement, understanding of the First Nation, and the imperatives for the future going forward to seek and build new partnership opportunity when it proves to be useful for the betterment of the Wampanoag First Nation, maintain those relationships and make them stronger, and continue advancing reconciliation measures to manage mutually our territory. I wanted to just end with a story about Henry Ford that came to our community by way of an accidental moment. He was coming up the St. Clair River, and his yacht experienced engine problems. Some of our Indian men went out to rescue his crew and Henry Ford, brought them to safety on our territory. Henry Ford said to the Indian members of Walpole Island that rescued him, said, "Where am I?" And they said, "Well, you're on Walpole Island and you need to talk to our minister that was nearby. His residence was close to the Anglican Church. He happened to be Reverend Simpson Brigham, one of the first graduates from Huron College. He was a member of Walpole Island First Nation, and he was posted here on Walpole Island." Reverend Brigham and Henry Ford started a conversation that continued to a friendship. Henry Ford would come back to church on Walpole Island. He saw the beauty of our community, and he asked Reverend Brigham, that he saw the beauty of the land, and we had so much fertile acres of land. Why aren't we farming our land in a large-scale way? Reverend Brigham said, "Have you ever heard of the Indian Act?" To Henry Ford. And Henry Ford said, "No, what's that got to do with this?" So Reverend Brigham said, "There's one clause in the Indian Act that says Indian lands can't be seized under legal process. Well, the industrialist Henry Ford, he knew exactly what that meant. He said, you've got all this land, but you can't go to a bank and use your land as collateral, because if there was a loan, if you defaulted on the loan, the bank couldn't take your land as collateral. So Henry Ford knew that right away. He said, okay, I understand what's going on. He said to Reverend Brigham, well, his solution was, I'm going to be part of establishing the first Indian bank in Canada on Walpole Island. So Henry Ford went through all the necessary steps to get a charter for Walpole Island First Nation Bank. And it took forever. He had all kinds of delays and red tape, I mean, that he had to get around. And he got so frustrated, he said, forget about that, Reverend Brigham. He said, I'll just give you the cultivators and the tractors and the machinery that that you need to start farming in a large way. So more importantly, he took 3 of our Indian men to Dearborn, Michigan, to teach them not how to grow things, because we knew how to do that. He taught them how to maintain the equipment. So that today, Walpole Island has one of the largest cash crop farms, agricultural farms in southwestern Ontario. And looking back, it was about Henry Ford. He knew about economic reconciliation in the 1920s, but even Henry Ford couldn't get there. He couldn't get to the finish line, but he got there in a different way. He was able to, it's like the adage, if you teach man to fish, he can eat for the day, but if you teach man, or if teach him to fish, then he can feed the world. So that's what we're trying to get to, and I know it's difficult. So for all the public works attendees, it's meaningful. It's you'll be satisfied, but it does take a long time to get to reconciliation. But we're there for you, and it'll be better for not only us, but it'll be better for everyone else. Just think about those 3 wind farms, over $3 billion our investors and Walpole Island invested in those projects. We plowed $3 billion into Ontario's economy. We're not stupid investors. Over the 20-year contract, we'll have another $3 billion plus. We're going to plow that back into Ontario's economy. We'll all benefit from First Nations advancing in a reconciliation, a good way. Miigwech. Thank you.
Dean, thank you very much for that very informative presentation. We have a lot of folks online that are often doing projects that requires engagement First Nations right across Ontario. A lot of EA practitioners on the line as well. I do have one question that's been posted, and it's asking if you could comment on Ontario's Bill number 5 and your thoughts on Bill number 5.
Yeah, that's an obstacle that we're addressing right now. That's going to take all of us, not just First Nations. It's going to take the natural heritage community, the archaeological community, all the citizens in Ontario to really understand the bill and the negative effects it would have going forward. As I mentioned in my presentation, there's no quick fix, and a bill like that won't create opportunities overnight. It'll create more issues that have to be addressed. So you just have to keep steady towards reconciliation, working with the species, and and good things will come with that. There's no shortcut to stewardship. It's staying as the steady course. So I think Bill 5 is just wrong-headed. It's not the way to go. We recognize that we can do it together. I think it's better to try to work together on legislation with the public, not just from the top down.
Excellent. As we have a lot of folks here that are doing a variety of different types of EAs, I was wondering, one of the things that you said that I found very, very informative, and that is moving from thinking about impact avoidance and moving to collaboration and partnership. It's kind of a shift of thinking when you're approaching a project. Um, you oftentimes are thinking about risk management, mitigations, impact avoidance, as you mentioned, but then shift that thinking to well-being and equity participation. Could you give us an example of a project that started the one way and you were able to as a team shift it to the positive way of thinking and executing the project?
Well, just going back to the Hydro One announcement, it's taken decades to educate upper management at Hydro One. And once they saw the opportunities of equity participation instead of hosting agreements and mitigating uh, impacts, they saw the opportunity to send a message to the corporate industry that the shift towards equity participation is going to benefit everyone. In a project basis, we've had a number of situations where we have brought in our traditional knowledge to projects to bring in some value to make the project better. An example of that is the Gordie Howe International Bridge project, 6 billion plus project that's going to be completed this fall. You can write that down.
Okay.
And you can also witness that it's our recommendation that the first car over that new bridge will be driven by our First Nation chief. The first people will be the first ones to cross that bridge. We were we negotiated benefits of better. We actually negotiated that our labor force was were offered the front of the line for any job. Any job on the Gordie Howe International Bridge would be offered to our workforce first. And a lot of people would say, well, that's discrimination, reverse discrimination. Well, uh, we actually have a Human Rights Commission code in Ontario. The Ontario Human Rights Code allows for First Nations to get in the front of the line as long as our workers have the same qualifications because of all the marginalization that's happened in the past.
Right.
Uh, that was a long-term project over 20 years of engagement, and finally we're seeing some benefits. In the Herb Gray Parkway portion of that project, we were able to bring in our natural heritage company to do some transplanting of transferring some of the species at risk. And there was another company, a nursery company that was working right next to our group from Walpole Island. And the proponent then measured the success of successful transplants of species and plants to a new area. And the nursery company had a lower rate of success of transplanting plants, and our group were higher success rates. They couldn't understand that where they were working side by side, and because our workers they actually had ceremony over the plants. They talked to the plants to let them know what they were doing and transplanting them. And they talked to them and treated them in a very gentle way, and that contributed to the greater success and knowing the plants and their importance to the area. We've also brought in some of our on a non-traditional way. We've improved the bottom line of the profits of some corporations, and of course they love that. So it's the value that we bring to the table.
Right.
It's got to be recognized that there is value. It's not another stumbling block. It brings value. It makes the project stronger with Indigenous involvement.
Very good. Very good. Don't have any questions coming up online at this point. I was asked if there's transcripts of the presentation to be made available. I would say we do post the presentation slides themselves, but I think this is a little different here where you're asking for the transcripts. So we'll work on that and try to make that happen. The presentations are recorded, and we'll try to make it available to our membership. I have one last question, and it's, meaningful engagement for any project to have meaningful engagement is really important. You had a sentence in your presentation, we are the experts. And I think that's a really important a thing to key in on. And I think I would ask if you could maybe expand on that a little bit for us.
Yes. So some of the projects that we've been involved with, they go to environmental assessments and environmental hearings. So we understand the process. It takes a while. It's not rocket science, but it is a process that can work for Indigenous peoples as well. So when proponents come to First Nations, I mentioned there is a mutual reciprocal obligation to come to the table, not just to say no, but to make the project better. And we have accommodations as well that we can share with the proponent. So it's the others don't know who we are. With the slides that I showed in my presentation, that's history for all First Nations. All First Nations have to go through the Indian Act. All First Nation have a community spirit and have different economies for their territory and for their communities. It's up to the First Nations to advance who they are. They have to come to the table and they have to educate others because others don't know who we are. And by doing the history, the civic part of that engagement, it makes the process better. The Herb Gray Parkway was a major part of the Gordie Howe International Bridge. The way in which the proponent reached out to Walpole Island for involvement, we said, yes, we just don't want the open houses with the boards. We want to engage with you through our talking circles. So that slide that I had up on micro ecosystems, we had a focus group or a talking circle. We called it a ecosystem circle for each one of those 5 microsystems. And it was like a focus group. We invited the Ministry of Transportation to come to the circle meetings, and we talked about say the wetlands or the tall grass prairies, and they listened and they were invited to participate in the circles. And at one of the circle meetings, one of the members from Walpole Island talked about the 7 sacred teachings, often referred to as grandfather teachings, grandmother teachings, and that was the MTO, the Ministry of Ontario, was curious, and they wanted to know more. When they heard that there were 7, they said, oh, you know what? We've got 7 pedestrian overpasses for the parkway. And all of a sudden, we were on the same page. So we were able to get a lot of signage and education on those overpasses, more green spaces. We have sculptures. We've got our plaques about our history of treaties, the sculpture of Turtle Island, telling those stories of our ancestors, of who we are. So we have been able to reach out to the general public in a different way through the pedestrian overpasses. And each of those overpasses, they went further. They understood the treaties, and MTO said, "What are those?" They were curious that our ancestors signed the treaties. They painted their totems, their clan totems on the treaties. So we were able to use those totems on the pillars of the overpasses. So when you drive to Windsor, you won't be able to see the overpass, what's on top, but on the pillars, you'll see our clan totem. So I could say if you go past the bear symbol, you're going too far. You miss that exit. If you're going past the crane, you miss that one. So right. You do it every day, but you don't realize that we're sharing who we are.
Right. Excellent. Well, we've come to the end of our webinar time. There are no questions in the queue waiting. With that, Dean, on behalf of OPWA, I'd like to thank you so much for doing this presentation. I have been lucky enough to be at Walpole Island, so I know how beautiful it is. Thank you for sharing your stories. Thank you for sharing your experiences. Many of the participants on this call here are often working with First Nation communities across Ontario, some across Canada. So this wisdom is very important to us. So with that, Dean, thank you so much. And I will conclude the webinar.
Yep. We can do it together.
We can do it together. Thank you very much.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.